Mr. Zindler, if reason and logic are convention or custom or arise by evolutionary chance out of the material universe, what is your reason for using reason for testing truth and reality? In other words, do you have a reason for your reason, or is it just your blind faith?
The ability to reason obviously was something that conferred selective advantage on various primate species. Indeed, the ability to reason and interpret sense data from the environment accurately has been part of the vertebrate evolutionary scheme itself. We find it perhaps most highly developed in the human species, but it certainly exists in our primate cousins as well. We use it because it works. We survive because this nervous system, which functions according to what we call conventionally now the rules of logic, because it works. It's a very pragmatic sort of thing. A species that evolved a logic or a nervous system that supported a logic that was not valid would not survive. It would be weeded out and replaced by a species that had a logic that worked better. And indeed, one of the famous philosophers of science, Karl Popper, has himself developed a theory of epistemology, a theory of knowledge, in which he accounts for these meta-theories themselves in terms of evolution, that there is sort of a natural selection going on among logical systems, among philosophical systems. But actually my answer is a very simple pragmatic one. We use it because it works and allows us to survive.
I think that the question points to a deep incoherence in the atheist point of view. Namely, if our beliefs are formed simply as a result of the selective advantage, that means that our belief-forming mechanisms don't aim at truth, they aim at survival. So how do we know that everything that we believe is not really true, it's just something that helps you to survive? In other words, there's no reason to think that the evolutionary story itself is true rather than just something that has survival value. Worse than that, Mr. Zindler is a determinist, and therefore everything that he thinks is just like, say, having a toothache or a limb growing a leaf. There is no truth to it, it's just all determined. So how do you know that the views that you hold to aren't simply the result of physical stimuli rather than rationality? I think that atheism is ultimately destructive of rationality itself.
By presenting a defense of the Christian faith that appealed to reason, Lewis removed obstacles to belief that many people faced.
Lewis saw reason as being the anchor of faith. He knew that a faith that was based only on emotions would be the kind of faith that would change from one moment to the next.
Faith in the sense in which I am here using the word, he wrote, is the art of holding on to things your reason has once accepted, in spite of your changing moods. Lewis pointed out, our hearts must be on fire for the things of God, and so must our reason. While God wants us to be as loving and teachable as children, Lewis underlined that God also wants every bit of intelligence we have.
He's the best that God has given us so far at reaching his world, at fencing with stupidity. And I've ever so gently, but knife with a little twist in it, puncturing the pomposity and the pretensions of so-called thinkers.
For example, in Miracles, when he actually goes after the idea that you can't trust your reason, you can't trust your thinking if we simply are the product of random chance evolution. That's a kind of presuppositional argument. He's basically saying, if there is no God, you can't actually even trust your reason. And of course, Alvin Plantinga later on took that idea and has developed it much more completely. So he uses all kinds of arguments. They've been extremely helpful to me.
For example, he talks about naturalism, the idea that there is not a creator, that we are simply a material product. We are the result of some natural processes of evolution. And he says people who believe that have a deep problem because they have to rely upon a brain that was formed by a natural process to make an informed judgment. So how can they know that their brain is reliable? He said naturalism is like someone trying to lift himself up by his collar. He won't be able to get off the ground, but he may strangle himself.
By restoring reason to its rightful place, Lewis showed how Christianity could appeal to those who were earnestly seeking for answers to the great questions of life.
Now, the general topic of this Veritas set of Veritas lectures, the Veritas Forum, is something like religion and science, the relation between religion and science. Lots of people claim there is a conflict of one kind or another between religion and science. And the lecture I want to give tonight is on that very topic. It's on the question, it's on a certain kind of conflict between religion and science. But religion, of course, comes in many different varieties. There's Christianity and many varieties of that as far as that goes, but there's also Hinduism and Buddhism, Judaism, Islam, still others. There's also naturalism, what I call naturalism. The title of this is an evolutionary argument against naturalism. And I don't want to argue about words. I won't, just claim straightforwardly that naturalism is a religion, but it plays many of the roles. It fulfills many of the functions of a religion, so it's like a religion. And by naturalism, I'm thinking of a certain kind of worldview, a certain way of thinking about the world, where the basic idea is that there isn't any such person as God or anything at all like God. So naturalism is a little stronger than atheism. You could be an atheist without being a naturalist, but you can't be a naturalist without being an atheist, all right? You might call naturalism high-grade atheism, or atheism plus. So that's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about naturalism, and I say it's like a religion, and I want to claim that there is indeed a conflict between religion and science. It's a conflict between naturalism and science. So what we've got here is an evolutionary argument, an argument from evolution against naturalism. And what I aim to argue is that you can't sensibly accept both evolution, which is a prime scientific theory, very widely accepted, and many people say very heavily supported by evidence and the like. You can't sensibly accept both evolution and naturalism. Now, I told you what I thought what naturalism is. When I speak of evolution, I just mean the sorts of things one learns in high school and college about the origin of life, the origin of all the vast variety of plant and animal life we find, including human beings. The basic idea is that by a process of descent with modification, all of this vast variety of life came to be. And the basic idea further is that what drives this whole process of descent with modification is natural selection, survival of the fittest if you like, natural selection working on some form of genetic variation, like for example random genetic mutation, all right? That's what evolution is. Now you know what evolution is, now you know what naturalism is, so now I can start with my lecture here. So the first bit there, the problem, theism, as you all know, is the view that we human beings have been created by a wholly good, all-powerful, all-knowing person who has created the world and created us in his image. Naturalism, I said what that was. you see some examples of naturalists on the sheet there. Carl Sagan, the late Carl Sagan, the late Stephen Jay Gould, the philosopher David Armstrong, Darwin himself, towards the end of his life anyway, the philosophers John Dewey and Bertrand Russell, contemporary biologist Richard Dawkins, a biologist at Oxford, the contemporary philosopher Daniel Dennett with his book Darwin's Dangerous Idea. The list goes on. There are lots of naturalists, and in fact, some people like John Lucas at Oxford University say that naturalism is the contemporary academic orthodoxy. That is, in the West, in the United States and Western Europe. Maybe that's true, but in any event, naturalism is very strong. Now, my argument has to do with cognitive faculties. There's a lot of philosophy in this talk, and I understand you're not all philosophy majors. Well, I mean, that's regrettable, but, you know, that's life. So just bear with me, and this is the way philosophers talk. Words like cognitive faculties, all right? By cognitive faculties, I just mean to refer to whatever it is that produces beliefs in us. For example, memory is an example of a cognitive faculty. Perception, I look out, I form the belief, this belief forms in me, lots of people here. A priori intuition, another miserable philosophical term, whatever it is by virtue of which you know mathematics and logic, all right? These are cognitive faculties, and my talk has to do with cognitive faculties. Now, from a theistic point of view, from the point of view of Christian theism, it's natural to think that our cognitive faculties are, for the most part, and over a large range of their operation, reliable, because God created us in His image, and an important part of being in God's image is resembling Him with respect to being able to know things. God knows everything. Very few of us do, though some of us maybe think we almost do. But we resemble God in virtue of being able to know. So it's natural to think from a theistic point of view that human cognitive faculties, at least at certain basic levels, human cognitive faculties are reliable. And there you see a couple of quotations from the great philosopher Thomas Aquinas, the great Catholic philosopher. The Catholics really like Thomas Aquinas, though you can't really claim that he's a Catholic philosopher because he considerably predated the Reformation. So Protestants like me might also like to claim Thomas Aquinas. In any event, there's what Thomas Aquinas says. He says, since human beings are said to be in the image of God in virtue of their having a nature that includes an intellect, that's how they are in the image of God. They've got an intellect like God. Such a nature, that is one with an intellect, is most in the image of God in virtue of being most able to imitate God, in virtue of being most able to be like God. So of all the things about us, you might say, Aquinas thinks the thing about us that is most important for being in the image of God is being able to know and understand. All right? I'll skip the next little quotation there from Aquinas. And then go down, so now I'm sort of towards the bottom of the left-hand column. Most of us think, or would think on reflection if we thought about it, that at least a function or purpose of our cognitive faculties is to provide us with true beliefs. What do they do? What are they for? What's their purpose? Well, it's to provide us with true beliefs. And we go on to think that when they function properly, that is, in accord with our design plan, when there isn't any insanity or dysfunction, then for the most part, they do produce true beliefs. That's what they do. It's, of course, the case that if there's an accident and you have 5 different witnesses to the accident, you're likely to get 5 different stories. So human beings don't agree, so they can't all be right. So there's not you might say, not total reliability. But even though there will be 5 different stories, at a deeper level there will be agreement. For example, it will be agreed that it's an automobile accident and not, for example, a volcanic eruption or a naval disaster or something like that. People will agree on how many cars, at least roughly speaking, how many cars are involved. It won't be that some say it was a 1-car accident. This person fell asleep, drove off the road and hit a tree. And others say, no, it was a 95 Los Angeles freeway type crack up, 95 cars involved. There won't be that kind of disagreement. There will be agreement as to roughly where this happened. Maybe it happened, it won't be, some people say it happened in California, and others say no, what had happened was in Florida or maybe Iraq or something like that. There'll be even deeper levels of agreement than that. People will agree that there are such things as automobiles, that people use them in order to fulfill their purposes, and for the most part what that involves is going somewhere. People use them for that. That they're seldom driven by 3-year-olds, that they won't work well at the bottom of the ocean or on the moon, that they tend to fall down rather than up if you drop them out of a helicopter, and so on. So you might say surface disagreement, but deeper agreement. Well, now all that fits in pretty well with theism, but what about naturalism? So at the bottom of the first page there, isn't there a problem here for the naturalist? At any rate, for the naturalist who thinks that we in our cognitive faculties have arrived upon the scene after some billions of years of evolution by way of natural selection, genetic drift, and other blind processes working on such sources of genetic variation as random genetic mutation. Suppose that's how you think we got to be here. You're a naturalist, and you also accept evolution. You accept these two things. I'm going to call them N and E later on. So you accept both naturalism and evolution. Then I want to say, I think you've got a problem here about the reliability of our cognitive faculties. Richard Dawkins, whom I mentioned a moment ago, according to Peter Medawar was a brilliant biologist, say, of my father's generation. According to Peter Medawar, Richard Dawkins was, quote, one of the most brilliant of the rising generations of biologists. And Richard Dawkins once leaned over and remarked to the philosopher A.J. Ayer at one of those elegant, candlelit, bibulous Oxford College dinners. And if you haven't seen an Oxford College dinner, you haven't seen elegant, candlelit, and bibulous. He leaned over and said to Ayer that he couldn't imagine being an atheist before 1859, which is the year that Darwin's great book, Charles Darwin's great book, Origin of Species, was published. He said, although atheism might have been logically tenable before Darwin, Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. Now, what I want to argue is that, and then next there's a little quotation from Dawkins that I won't read now. What I want to argue is that Dawkins is dead wrong about that. Evolution does not make it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. As a matter of fact, I think the truth lies in the opposite direction. All right? Because if naturalism and evolution are true, then the ultimate purpose of our cognitive faculties, memory, perception, as I mentioned before, sort of logical, mathematical intuition, the way in which we know about other people, the way in which we make inductions, and so on. The ultimate purpose of these things is not truth, not the production of true beliefs, but rather survival, or maybe survival and reproduction, or survival through reproductive age, or maybe something like, if you want to put it more technically, maximization of reproductive fitness. That's what their purpose is. That's what they're for. Not for the purpose, they're not for the production of true beliefs. That's not their purpose. It's rather maximizing fitness, all right? So here's a quotation from a naturalist philosopher, Patricia Churchland. She says this, boiled down to essentials, a nervous system enables the organism to succeed in the 4 F's: feeding, fleeing, fighting, and reproducing. The principle, I'm just reporting what Patricia Churchland says. I don't take any responsibility for it, all right? I'm just, that's what she says. The principal chore of nervous systems, of the brain, let's say, the principal chore of nervous systems and of your cognitive faculties is to get the body parts where they should be in order that the organism may survive. Improvements I guess we can ignore the next sentence, but I'll read it anyway. Improvements in sensory motor control confer an evolutionary advantage. A fancier style of representing, and believing is thought of as representing, is advantageous so long as it is geared to the organism's way of life and enhances the organism's chances of survival, she says. And then she says, truth, whatever that is, definitely takes the hindmost. So what she means here, what she means to say is pretty much what I was saying just a moment before, namely that what natural selection, evolution, is interested in is not true belief. Natural selection doesn't care what you think. Natural selection cares only about how you behave. Natural selection promotes adaptive behavior, you might say, rewards adaptive behavior with survival and so on, survival and reproduction, and penalizes other kinds of behavior, maladaptive behavior, but natural selection doesn't give a toot about what you think. It's interested only, you might say, in behavior. All right, that's why truth, whatever that is, definitely takes the hindmost. Now I'm going to skip a couple of those little paragraphs. That induces a certain kind of worry for those who accept naturalism and also think that our cognitive faculties have come to be by way of evolution. And Darwin himself is aware of this problem. With me, says Darwin, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of men's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals, whether these convictions are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind, if there are any convictions in such a mind? So Darwin himself saw that if you accept naturalism and evolution, you've got a worry about the reliability of our belief system or the reliability of our cognitive faculties, all right? And I'm going to call that worry, I'm going to call that Darwin's doubt. Darwin's doubt. Okay. So section B there, Darwin's doubt. I want to ask this question now. How can we make Darwin's doubt, how can we make it a little bit more precise? Philosophers always try to make things more precise. Sometimes they make things so precise, nobody can understand them at all. And I'll try not to do that. So I'm going to try not to make it so precise that you can't understand it, but I'd like to make it a little bit more precise. What exactly is Darwin's doubt? How should we think about it? Well, I think we can think about it in terms of, and here's another piece of philosophy, sorry about this, in terms of conditional probability, all right? Very often you ask, what's the probability of one proposition given some other proposition on the condition that some other proposition is true, okay? It's a very simple idea. We do this all the time. So you might say, what's the probability that Mr. A will live to be 70 given that, or on the condition that Mr. A is now 35, is 100 pounds overweight, eats nothing but junk food, is a total couch potato and never gets any exercise. What's the probability that he'll live to be 70? Well, I don't know, not so high maybe. On the other hand, what's the probability that Mr. B will live to be 70, given that Mr. B is now 65, runs 10 miles every day, watches his diet like a hawk, and has 4 grandparents, all of whom live to be over 100. Well, that probability is going to be much higher, right? So you've got the probability of one proposition on another, one proposition given another, you might say, and you write it P, if I had a big blackboard, I would write that. P of A on, with a slash for on, B. P of A on B, the probability of proposition A on proposition B. You might say, what's the probability that Jock is a Mormon on the proposition, given the proposition that Jock lives in Glasgow and is a Scotsman? That's probably a rather low probability. There aren't very many Mormons in Glasgow. What's the probability that Brigham is a Mormon, given that Brigham lives in Salt Lake City? Well, that's going to be much higher, all right? So now you've got the idea of conditional probability. Okay, And so I say here, Darwin's doubt. Here's one possibility for how we can make this a bit more precise, a bit clearer. Perhaps Darwin and Churchland mean to propose that a certain conditional probability is low. The probability of human cognitive faculties being reliable, that's one proposition. On this proposition, given that human cognitive faculties have been produced by evolution, Dawkins' blind evolution, unguided by the hand of God or any other person. If naturalistic evolution is true, then our cognitive faculties will have resulted from blind mechanisms, like natural selection, working on sources of genetic variation, like random genetic mutation. And the ultimate purpose or function or chore of our cognitive faculties, if they have a purpose or function, will be survival, or maybe I should say maximization of fitness, survival of individual species, gene, or genotype. But then it's unlikely that they have the production of true belief as a function. So the probability of our faculties being reliable, given naturalistic evolution, will be low. And I want to write that there as you see it. The probability of R stands for that our cognitive faculties are reliable, given N and E, where N stands for naturalism and E stands for evolution, stands for the proposition that our faculties, like the rest of us, have come to be by way of evolution. All right? So I say, here's what Darwin's doubt is then. Darwin's doubt is this, that the probability of R on N and E, that probability is low. It's unlikely, given N and E, that our cognitive faculties are in fact reliable. Okay, well then that's what just below there, it says that N is metaphysical naturalism, and crucial to this belief is the view that there's no such person as the God of traditional theism. E is that human cognitive faculties have arisen by way of evolution, and R is the claim that our cognitive faculties are reliable. And now here's the question, what's the probability of R given N and E? Darwin seems to think this probability is relatively low. And Darwin's doubt is the idea that that probability is low. Okay? Now, all this is crystal clear so far, right? I mean, it's really, really very clear, right? Right. Okay. Okay, now the next section then, the doubt developed. The doubt developed. So to develop this doubt, I want to argue that Darwin's doubt is a real doubt and that this probability really is low. So suppose we think to develop this doubt first, not just about ourselves and our ancestors, but in order to avoid interspecies chauvinism, suppose we think instead about some other hypothetical population on some other planet, all right? A hypothetical population of creatures rather like ourselves on a planet similar to Earth. Darwin did the same thing in a way when he proposed that we think about another species, such as monkeys. Let's suppose that these creatures have cognitive faculties, that they hold beliefs, that they change beliefs, that they make inferences and the like. And let's suppose further that these creatures have arisen by way of the selection processes endorsed by contemporary evolutionary thought. And let's add still further that they live in a naturalistic universe. There is no such person as God who has been guiding the process of evolution. So what's the probability that their faculties are reliable? What is P of R on N and E specified now, not to us, but to them? That's our question. Well, and I'm going to skip the next little bit there. The first thing to see is that it's likely that their behavior is or is adaptive. I mean, their behavior is adaptive if they've survived, either to their current environment or maybe to the environment when their cognitive faculties were in fact developed, and when they came to be, the environment that was current when that species came to be. Their behavior is adaptive, but nothing so far follows about their beliefs, because as I was saying, natural selection isn't interested in the truth of your beliefs, it's interested only in the adaptiveness of your behavior. And here, now this next little bit is the hardest part. Let me apologize again for being a philosopher and so on. So the next little bit here, the way in which I want to argue that the probability of R on N and E is low is by dividing up N and E into 4 subcases. And then I want to argue that the probability of R on N and E and each of those 4 subcases is low, all right? And then it'll follow that it's low overall. And these subcases all have to do with the way in which behavior is related to belief. Evolution, you might say, can only see behavior. It can't see belief directly. It can only see behavior, and it's only interested in behavior. It promotes adaptive behavior and rewards adaptive behavior, but penalizes behavior that's not adaptive. So if evolution can modify belief, or if evolution can bring it about that our beliefs are for the most part reliable, that our faculties are reliable, this will only be if there's the right relationship between belief on the one hand and behavior on the other. So these 4 subcases all have to do with the relation between belief and behavior. All right. The first one is epiphenomenalism. Another miserable term, but there it is. Maybe the first one, epiphenomenalism, that's the idea that beliefs don't cause behavior at all. Beliefs don't get involved in the causal chain that leads to behavior, all right? That's the view that was put forward by Thomas Huxley, who is often called Darwin's bulldog. And that happened as follows. Darwin himself was a very shy, retiring man. He didn't like arguments, and he didn't like getting in disputes, and he didn't like hostile intellectual exchanges and so on. But given what he said, he was always getting into arguments and into disputes and having hostile intellectual exchanges. But he had this friend, Thomas Huxley, who liked nothing better than a mean, low-down, knock-down, drag-out intellectual fight. So he would take Huxley along, and then when he'd give his lecture and people would be sort of hot under the collar after his lecture, start asking him a whole bunch of hostile questions, he would just turn things over to Huxley. So that's how Huxley got to be called Darwin's bulldog. Anyway, Huxley thought that epiphenomenalism is the truth of the matter. And many people, in fact, do think so. But here's what Huxley said. He said, "It may be assumed that molecular changes in the brain are the causes of all the states of consciousness." So it's molecular changes in the brain that cause you to see a certain kind of color when you look out over the ocean and cause you to hear something when one of your friends speaks to you. But is there any evidence that these stages of consciousness may conversely cause molecular changes in the brain, which give rise to muscular motion? I see no such evidence. Consciousness appears to be completely without any power of modifying the working of the body, just as the steam whistle of a locomotive engine is without influence upon its machinery. So that's epiphenomenalism, and that's the picture, a steam engine, the whistle blows, but it's the workings of the machine, of the steam engine that causes the whistle to blow, but the sound of the whistle doesn't, in its turn, doesn't do anything to the steam engine. Okay, epiphenomenalism. Now, if epiphenomenalism were true, the first of these 4 cases, then one's beliefs would be invisible to evolution. Evolution can only see behavior, but if behavior doesn't cause or isn't causally related, isn't caused by belief, then evolution couldn't see belief. And then the fact that the beliefs of these creatures, their cognitive faculties, arose during the evolutionary history of these beings, that wouldn't confer any probability at all on the idea that their beliefs are mostly true, or mostly nearly true, rather than wildly false. Indeed, the probability of their being mostly true would have to be estimated as low. The probability that a randomly chosen large set of propositions contains the many more true beliefs than false beliefs that reliability requires, that's a low probability. A while back, Time magazine had a story about scientists and human behavior, and they wrote this about John Maynard Smith, a very famous biologist. They wrote, "A few years ago, he," that is Smith, "wrote that he had never understood why organisms have feelings," or he could have said beliefs. "After all, orthodox biologists believe that behavior, however complex, is governed entirely by biochemistry." So what causes your behavior? Well, it's biochemical, neurophysiological changes in your nervous system. So behavior is caused entirely by biochemistry, and that the attendant sensations, fear, pain, wonder, love, and you might as well have added belief, are just shadows cast by that biochemistry, not themselves vital to the organism's behavior. Okay? So then on the first of these four subcases then, epiphenomenalism, the probability of R on N and E together with epiphenomenalism, that will be low. All right? Okay. Now the second one. And the second one is the hardest one. I mean, so sort of the hardness graph. Many of you are interested in graphs and so on. The hardness graph for this lecture will kind of go like this till we get to this point where we are right now, and it'll go back down like that. All right? So if you've stuck with me this far, stick with me through this next little bit, we'll be all set. Okay. The second possibility, let me see if I can explain that. Suppose you ask yourself what, now if you're a naturalist, you will also be a materialist about human beings. You'll think that human beings are material objects, that it's not the case that a human being really is a soul with a body or a mind with a body, but a material object of some sort, all right? Then ask yourself, what would a belief be from that point of view? What would you think a belief was? A belief. You and I each have lots of beliefs. Among my beliefs, for example, is that I live in Indiana, but that I'm right here in California right now, and lots of people here. The ocean is there, and it's very nice and warm today, etc. There are lots of beliefs, and I have lots of beliefs, and the same goes for all of you. Well, what is a belief? From the point of view of materialism, the only thing you can think of really for a belief to be would be something like a long-standing event in your nervous system. A nervous system in your brain maybe involving lots of neurons connected together and working together in a certain way. That's what a belief would have to be, all right? There are something like, I don't know, 100 billion neurons, lots of neurons to go around, enough for lots and lots of beliefs. So a belief would have to be a long-standing neuronal event. That's what a belief would have to be from this point of view. Well, a belief would have to have then two very different kinds of properties or attributes. Such a neuronal event, if it's a real belief, would first of all have neurophysiological properties like, say, consisting of 1,000 neurons. So how many neurons, how they're connected with each other, the rate at which they fire, the rate at which they fire in one part of this event related to the rate that they fire in some other part of the event, and how the rate of fire changes with respect to signals coming from other neural structures. Those things, neurophysiological properties, how this event is connected via some kind of cable of nerves with, say, certain muscles in your body. All of these are neurophysiological properties. But if this thing really is a belief, it's got to have a property of another kind, totally different kind. It has to be the belief that P, for some proposition P, it has to be the belief that, for example, there once was a brewery where the Metropolitan Opera House in New York City now stands. All right, it has to be related to a proposition in such a way that that proposition is its content. It's which belief that belief is, you might say, all right? That's a very different kind of property. It's not neurophysiological. It's, you might say, semantic or semantical. Okay? Well, now I can explain the second of the three kinds of relationships, the three subcases of N and E. In the second one, beliefs cause behavior is caused by beliefs. Beliefs cause behavior, but only by virtue of their neurophysiological properties and not by virtue of their content. Only by virtue of their neurophysiological properties and not by virtue of their content. So that means if you've got a belief that's got a certain content and a certain set of neurophysiological properties, if that event had the same neurophysiological properties but a different content, it still would have made the same contribution to behavior. What causes behavior is whatever causes muscular motion. And what causes that are signals sent along cables of nerves from the brain or from such things as this belief we're talking about to the muscles, all right? And there's no room in there for the content to get involved in the causal chain that leads to behavior. Okay, we could call that, we could call it, we could call it semantic epiphenomenalism. But at any rate, it's maybe the most important of these four subcases. So here the idea is that belief causes behavior, but only by virtue of the neurophysiological properties of beliefs, where the beliefs themselves are neural structures or neuronal events. Okay? All right. Okay, well now that was the top of the graph, so now we're going to go downhill, sort of from here on it'll be downhill. Okay, now under that suggestion too, just as under the first one, the probability of R on N and E is going to be low because natural selection, even though beliefs do cause behavior, they don't cause behavior by virtue of their content, and it's of course just by virtue of their content that they're either true or false. So on this suggestion, on this possibility, like the first, the probability of R on N and E is low. Well, let's skip the third one. The third one, that's C on the handout. Let's just skip that one and go on to the fourth one. The fourth possibility is the one that we think holds for ourselves. And on this possibility, the idea is that our beliefs cause our behavior and do so not just by virtue of neurophysiological properties, but by virtue of content as well. All right, so it's because you believe that there is some Dr. Pepper in the refrigerator. It's because you believe that your body heaves itself up out of your comfortable armchair and ambles over to the refrigerator and pulls open the door, all right? That's the idea for the fourth one, and that's the one that we think is the way in which we are, in fact, put together. That's the sort of common sense idea. So what's the probability of R on N and E together with this fourth possibility? And here I'll go back to the sheet. It's not as high as you might think, because beliefs don't causally produce behavior just by themselves. It's beliefs, desires, and other factors that together produce behavior. Then the problem is this. There are clearly any number of different patterns of behavior and desire that will issue in the same action. And among those, there will be many in which the beliefs are wildly false. So, for example, Paul is a prehistoric hominid. The exigencies of survival call for him to display tiger avoidance behavior. That's a kind of complicated way of saying there's a tiger after him. There will be many behaviors that are appropriate, fleeing, for example, or climbing a steep rock face. I'm assuming tigers aren't very good at rock climbing. I'm sure they've never mastered the use of the rope anyway. Or crawling into a hole too small to admit the tiger. This is a large tiger. Or leaping into a handy lake. When I wrote this, I was under the impression that tigers are like house cats in that they hate water. But I learned later on that's not true. So this is not, this is not a way to get away from a tiger. You could scratch that one. Okay, well, so pick any such appropriately specific behavior B. Pick any one of those behaviors, that would be a good way to get away from this tiger, a good adaptive action. Paul engages in B, we think, because, sensible fellow that he is, he has an aversion to being eaten, and he believes that this behavior B is a good means of thwarting the tiger's intention of eating him. But clearly this tiger avoidance behavior could result from 1,000 other belief-desire combinations. Indefinitely many other belief-desire systems will cause B equally well. For example, perhaps Paul very much likes the idea of being eaten, but when he sees a tiger, he always runs off looking for a better prospect because he thinks it unlikely that the tiger he sees will eat him. This will get his body parts in the right place as far as survival is concerned, but it doesn't involve much by way of true belief. Or maybe he thinks the tiger is a large, friendly, cuddly pussycat and wants to pet it. But he also believes that the best way to pet it is to run away from it. I used to have a cat that was like that. If you walked towards it, it would run away, but if you ran away, it would run after you. Or maybe he thinks the tiger is a regularly reoccurring illusion, and hoping to keep his weight down, has formed the resolution to run a mile at top speed whenever presented with this illusion. Or perhaps he thinks he's about to take part in a 1,600-meter race. He wants to win, and he believes that the appearance of the tiger is the starting signal. Or perhaps ... So the idea is that you can see there are lots of different desire and belief combinations that will cause the same behavior. And among those many different desire belief combinations, there are many where the beliefs involved are clearly false. All right? So the thought then is that under this suggestion too, the probability of R on N and E is not terribly high. Higher than under the other two we mentioned, no doubt, but still not terribly high. So other examples of adaptive false beliefs, I mean, these are sort of fanciful that I gave here, but there are lots of real life such examples too. Naturalists, of course, think that religious beliefs are all false, but naturalists also, for the most part, think religious beliefs are adaptive. They think that of two groups, one of which has lots of people in it who are religious and the other of which doesn't, the one with lots of religious people in it will on the whole do better because people will be inclined to cooperate with each other, for example, all right? So religion functions as a kind of group adaptation, even though, according to the naturalist, such beliefs are false. So putting these together, these probabilities together, it would be reasonable to think that the probability of R, of these creatures' cognitive systems being reliable, is low, less than a half. Now return to Darwin's doubt. The reasoning that applies to these hypothetical creatures, of course, also applies to us. So if we think the probability of R with respect to them is low on N and E, we should think the same thing about the probability of R with respect to us. Something like this reasoning, I think, is what underlies Darwin's doubt. And so if we accept N and E, then given that P of R on N and E for us is low, if we accept N and E, and here's the next important part, the next important point, if we accept N and E, once we see that the probability of R on N and E is low, if we accept N and E, then we have a defeater for our belief in R. We have a reason not to accept R, a reason to give it up, a reason to reject that belief R. If R is unlikely or improbable, given the way our faculties have come to be, then we have a reason to reject it or to withhold it. Okay? Okay. Now, so there are really two, my argument has two stages. First, P of R on N and E is low. And second, if we accept N and E, then we have a defeater for R, given that we know that P of R on N and E is low. And I've argued for the first of these two things. Now I'm going to argue very briefly for the second by virtue of a couple of analogies. All right? So first analogy, Sigmund Freud said that religious belief arises out of wish fulfillment. We human beings find ourselves in this cold, cruel world that doesn't care a bit about what happens to us. And we find it really hard to exist if we look this miserable situation we're in clearly in the face. But what we do instead then is we invent a Father in heaven who we say is really running things. And so it's not really the case that the appearance of indifference that nature presents to us is really the way things are. So imagine I'm reading Freud in an unduly receptive frame of mind after 3 martinis, for example. So I'm in an unduly receptive, I read Freud, and I say to myself, you bet, Freud's right, that's right. Well, then I would have a defeater, I would say, for any belief, for example, belief in God, any belief that I think is produced by wish fulfillment. I would have a defeater then in particular for my belief in God, since that belief, I now think, after having read Freud in this frame of mind, is a product of wish fulfillment. All right? So there's my first analogy. The second analogy goes like this. Consider now Descartes. Some of you have no doubt read Descartes, the great early modern philosopher Descartes, who starts off by asking himself, what can I really be sure of? You know, is there anything I can really be sure of? And he starts thinking of things. Well, can I be sure that, say, I'm seated in a chair with clothes on? Well, no, I could be dreaming that I'm seated in a chair with clothes on, even though I'm in fact lying in bed without any clothes on. All right? I don't know if that's how Descartes slept or not, but doesn't really matter. Then he goes on to mathematics. He said, well, can't I be sure that 2 plus 2 is 4? Can I be positive, really sure about that? And he thinks for a while, and he said, well, it could be. He thinks, yeah, that's right. But then he thinks a little more, and his face falls, and he says, no, I guess not. Because the reason he says is it could be, for all I know, that I've been created by an evil demon who loves to create people with false mathematical beliefs. All right? So maybe that's how I got to think that 2 plus 2 equals 4. Well, so Descartes got a defeater for all these different kinds of beliefs by thinking that way. So suppose I read Descartes again in an unduly receptive frame of mind after 3 martinis, and I think to myself, yeah, my friend George, he was created by such a Cartesian evil demon. Well, then I would have a defeater for anything my friend George says, unless I myself have independent evidence for that thing, right? And suppose I think a little further and I think, yeah, I think maybe I was too. Well, then I'd have a defeater for R, for this proposition R, that my cognitive faculties are reliable. Given the way in which my cognitive faculties came to be, as I believe it, I've got then a defeater for R, and that's the very same thing that goes for the naturalist. Okay, so now I'm on the last page here. Suppose we return to the person convinced of N and E who is agnostic about P of R on N and E. Something similar goes for him. He's in the same position with respect to any belief B of his as is the above believer in God. He's in the same condition as the person who comes to think she's been created by that Cartesian evil demon. So he has a defeater for B and a good reason for being agnostic with respect to any belief B he's got. Okay, well now we come finally to the argument. So here's the argument. P of R, it says here, is either low or inscrutable, but I've left the inscrutable part of it to the side just to save a little time. P of R on N and E we'll say is low. So if you accept N and E and you see that P of R on N and E is low, then you have a defeater for R. But if you've got a defeater for R, this belief that your faculties are reliable, then you've got a defeater for any other belief B that you might hold. For example, N and E itself. You've got a defeater for that. So one who accepts N and E has a defeater for N and E, a reason to doubt or to be agnostic with respect to it. If this person has no independent evidence for R, then the rational course would be to reject belief in N and E. If he has no independent evidence, then N and E is self-defeating and hence irrational. Now the next little bit goes on to argue that he can't have independent evidence. But I will skip over that again just to save time, but we can look at that during the question period if you like. He can't really give an argument for his faculties being reliable because any such argument would presuppose that the faculties are reliable and thus would be circular. So I say that the devotee of N and E has a defeater for N and E, a defeater that can't itself be defeated. Therefore, N and E is self-defeating and can't rationally accept it, can't rationally be accepted. So my argument then so far is that N and E is self-defeating. You can't believe both N and E, you can't sensibly believe both N and E, all right? That means that N and E conflict with each other. Naturalism then conflicts with evolution. Evolution is a prime example of an important contemporary scientific theory. Naturalism, therefore, conflicts with science. So I say there is a conflict between religion and science, but it's not between Christianity and science, it's between naturalism and science. Thank you.